You're finally here. You finally arrived. You've at last found the one place which holds the answers to the questions of the ages. You're excited. Your heart palpitates. Is it real? Can it be true? You're understandably hesitant, yet determinedly hopeful. That is good. Your faith in such matters will be rewarded. You'll not find pat and cliched answers here. No! Here is a place of clarity, of definition, of explanation, of truth. Here combines science and religion, removes tradition and replaces it with fact. Here the universe is holographic, yet tangible, ethereal, yet substantive. Here is a place where time is understood as atemporal. Here there is harmony amidst chaos. Here is where the darkened glass is finally cleared. Here is where you'll find the answers to all the unanswered questions which stretch across the cosmos.
And you are across the cosmos for the next hour. I am Chase Rockwell, and I am your host. I am joined once again in studio by my co-hosts,
Lou Rodgers,
Mark Wilson,
and David Cameron.
Alrighty, and we're going to get right into this today. Our topic is the Book
of Revelation.
Yes, it's that one. The one that everybody writes the movies about. The end of the world, death, destruction, disease, the four horsemen, the apocalypse, blah, 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 blah. As you might have already detected, I'm probably not on board with the conventional translation or interpretation, if you will, of the Book of Revelation. I have a lot of reasons for that, and we're going to cover most of them. Well, some of them, I guess, is a fair way to put it, in this episode. I'm going to start this episode by giving you a little bit of history. The Book of Revelation was written by the Apostle John. It's the last book in the Bible, and for folks who have been taught that the Bible is put together like a book, like a novel, like my novels, for example. I have chapter 1, and in some of my books it goes up to chapter 100. So that's a bit of an exaggeration, but not by much. They look at the Book of Revelation as the last chapter in a multi-chapter book. In this one, it's like 68 different books or chapters, if you will. Yeah. So that isn't the situation at all. But when you are taught that the Bible is put together like a book, like a novel, that's how it's regarded. So I'm going to give a little bit of history. And the history starts right around 64 AD. Now, in 64 AD, a fire of mysterious origin ravaged Rome. There was, and is today, much speculation as to whether or not the Emperor Nero ordered this fire. The reasons he could have are obvious. Rome at that time was a little better than a shantytown. Now, if you've ever seen pictures or been to the slums of Rio or Mumbai, India, or what have you, there was a lot of wood shacks, just cramped, crowded districts all about Rome, along with some of the more governmental buildings and what have you. But Nero wanted to build a new palace for himself. Nero regarded himself as a god and went to tremendous excesses, etc. Well, he wanted to build this new palace right around where the shantytown existed. The name of his new palace was going to be called the Domus Aurea, or, in English, the Golden House. Now, in order to build this new palace, he needed to clear the land and get rid of these shanties and the rabble which occupied them. There was no easy way to accomplish this task without incurring the wrath of these people unless he could pin the blame on someone else. In this regard, it was enter the Christians. Nero had already been engaging in persecutions of the Christians, but now he could do so with unfettered passion and with the approval of the now angry and enraged populace. Now, there was no evidence to suggest the Christians had anything to do with starting this fire, but at this point it was irrelevant. Blame had been fixed upon a fringe segment of their society, and a people who weren't clearly understood by the Hellenistic population to begin with became the scapegoat. Once the scapegoat had been chosen for the moment, that scapegoat, these Christians, would suffice. The Christian persecutions were then stepped up. Now, caught up in these persecutions were both the apostles Peter and the apostle Paul. There is speculation that Jesus' half-brother James also was martyred during this period. And the only reason I throw that in there is just to give you the magnitude of what was going on. There are 2 separate days given for James' death. And this is James, the half-brother of Jesus, not James, son of Zebedee, who also is in the Bible as well. 2 different historians give James' death between 62 and 69 AD. These deaths will figure greatly as we get on into the study of the book of Revelation. Now, in order for Nero to clear the land and build the Domus area, taxes also had to be raised and collected. Nero's previous antics had all but exhausted the treasury, leaving the empire dangerously low on funds. This latest round of tax collections put Nero on a collision course with many of his governors and with the Senate. The most effective challenge against the unfair tax imposed came from one of his senators named Vindex. Vindex aligned himself with Galba, who was a commander of the provincial area of Hispania. Now, that would be modern-day northwestern Spain, or northeastern Spain, rather. Vindex was killed in the ensuing battle by one of the commanders of Germania, which is basically modern-day Germany. And that happened early in 68 AD. But by that time, by the conclusion of this battle, the tide had already begun to turn against Nero. He essentially found himself without any support. So after Vindex had succeeded in stripping most all support from Nero, Galba now had wide-ranging support from the military. By June of 68 AD, and facing an uncertain future which he believed would be filled with torture, not surprisingly, Nero decided to commit suicide. But at the last moment, he broke weak, and he couldn't go through with it. He tried to get his Praetorian Guard to run him through. They refused to kill him. I guess they figured that whatever torture was coming to him would be far more preferable. So the deed was left to his personal secretary and former slave, Epaphroditus. And that was the end of Nero. He was dead. Galba succeeded him, and Galba was emperor for exactly 7 months, from June of 68 to January of 69. The aforementioned commander of Germania refused to swear allegiance to Galba, and this began the rebellion which saw Galba eventually assassinate himself and succeeded by one of Nero's friends, a noble named Otho. And Otho kind of modeled himself after Nero. He wanted to follow in the same footprints, and that didn't go over too well. Otho survived Galba as emperor for a mere 3 months. The Germanian legions wanted Vitellius as emperor, and just as they refused to accept Galba as emperor, they refused a buddy of Nero's even more. The legions began to move towards Rome in order to remove Otho. Despite having his own formidable army, Otho evidently didn't want to face what he saw as an inevitability, and he too committed suicide, stabbing himself in the heart with his own dagger. Vitellius, commander of the legions in Germania, ascended the throne as the new emperor in April of 69 AD, and reigned until December of that year for a total of 8 months. The whole of the Roman Empire had never coalesced behind Vitellius, and even if the Senate had, which they did, the rest of them did not, especially some of these legions. In July of 69, Vitellius learned that the eastern legions, commanded by Flavius Vespasian, had named them their emperor. One by one, Vitellius watched as other legions deserted him in favor of Vespasian. Now, Vespasian's troops eventually entered Rome, and there they assassinated Vitellius. Vespasian then became emperor, and his reign was somewhat longer. He remained as emperor for 10 years until his death in 79 AD. After a brief illness, Vespasian died. Vespasian's reign is very important for understanding the book of Revelation for a host of reasons. The first of which is that Vespasian's son, Titus, along with one of the other provincial governors, concluded the suppression of the Jewish rebellion, which Vespasian had first been charged with by Nero back in 66 AD. Titus oversaw the destruction of the temple and the Jewish diaspora. He subsequently commanded the troops which laid siege to the fortress of Masada, where over 900 Jews had fled, with a zealot named Eleazar ben Yair. These Jews survived in Masada for 3 years before the fortress was finally breached by the Roman army. Of the entire group of almost 1,000 people in Masada, only 7 people survived. There were 2 women and 5 children who had hid themselves in a cistern. Now, it's interesting, in Masada, in Judaism, it's a sin to commit suicide. So what they actually did is they drew lots to kill one another. That way, there was no suicide. The end of the siege at Masada in 73 AD marked the end of the Jewish occupation in Judea. It was no longer a Jewish land, essentially. A situation which remained formally until 1948, when modern-day Israel was created. That's almost 2,000 years. This bit of history is vitally important if one is to understand the book of Revelation. Without a knowledge of this history, Revelation takes on whatever meaning one wishes to attach to it. And as we have seen in the centuries since it was written, many different people have come to many different conclusions with respect to the meanings of the book of Revelation. By the early 19th century, one particular understanding regarding Revelation had taken hold within evangelical Christianity. This view is based primarily on two things. One, a lack of knowledge regarding the history of the first century Roman Empire and Judaism and Christianity. And two, an inaccurate dating of the book of Revelation based primarily upon the writings of Eusebius of Caesarea's ecclesiastical history. This writing was to set down the basic history of the church under Constantine the Great, who was a Roman emperor from 312 AD to 339 AD. And Constantine the Great is the one who is essentially regarded as the great savior of the Christian faith, primarily the impetus behind creating the Catholic Church as it is today. And part of his work was to rewrite the history of the early Christian church. And this was Eusebius' job, as well as Augustine's job and Tertullian's job, etc. Eusebius got his information, which he misinterpreted, from the earlier writings of an early church father named Irenaeus. Irenaeus wrote a huge work called Against Heresies, right around approximately 160 AD. What Irenaeus wrote is that John, the writer of the Apocalypse, was still alive in the last year of the reign of Emperor Domitian. Now, Emperor Domitian was Emperor Vespasian's youngest son, and he, Domitian, was assassinated in 96 AD. Now, interesting, the impetus for Domitian's assassination was because Domitian had recently ordered the execution of Nero's personal secretary, Epaphroditus, for helping Nero to commit suicide. And in other words, because Nero was killed, thus thwarting justice, Domitian wanted to take his pound of flesh out of somebody else. So this brings us to the book of Revelation. This is just a little bit of history, kind of give you an idea. Key in on how many emperors they had in 1 year. It's the year of 4 emperors is what it's called in history. When you go and you look at the book of Revelation, it's interesting to key on what John did and what he did not mention in the book as a huge clue as to when this book could have been written. Now, you have 2 essential dates. One which Eusebius set down, which is the last year of the reign of Domitian. That's 96 AD. The other one is the one which I subscribe to. And it is an earlier date that took place during the time of Nero, before Nero's suicide, before all of the martyrs. And I would place it personally somewhere around 66, maybe 67 AD. So that's 30 years difference. And in the large panoply of history, what does 30 years make? 2,000 years over 30. Well, it makes a lot of difference because of what occurred during that 30-year time period. If the book was actually written by John on Patmos around 66, 67 AD, then it's quite possible that Paul and Peter were both still alive. It's a certainty that the temple was still existing and that Jews were still in Judea. There was no siege at Masada. And another event that I didn't mention in my opening was the eruption of Vesuvius in Italy, which destroyed completely the towns of Pompeii and Herculaneum. It so thoroughly destroyed Herculaneum that Herculaneum was thought to have been a mythological town or place in much the same way as Atlantis is regarded. It wasn't until 20th century when they started doing excavations and what have you, I think for modern building projects, that they came across evidence of Herculaneum being there at all. And then all of a sudden, this mythological town from the dustbin of history suddenly became real. And putting all of that together with the fact that this was the longest period of time the Jews were out of their homeland ever, period. Even the Egyptian Sojourn.
Occupation?
Well, they weren't occupying Egypt, but they were there for 400 years
Re-education?
total. And even that just is a fraction of the time they were eventually away from their homeland in Jerusalem. I mean, almost 2,000 years. Now, why do I bring this up? Because if the book of Revelation had been written in 96 AD by John, at that point you were already looking at about 26, 27 years that they had been away from their homeland. There was no mention of any of that. No mention of the destruction of the temple in Revelation. No mention of the siege of Masada. None of these things, not even the absolute destruction of Vesuvius, was mentioned anywhere in this book. And that's important because every time you look at one of the exiles that took place in the Old Testament where the Jews were concerned, it was mentioned, whether it was a year, a week, 40 years, it doesn't matter. They mentioned it, and they used to make great mention of it, as I recall. I mean, I'm running through different places in my mind right now. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, it doesn't matter. The Egyptians, they always mentioned it except for this one time. And this, even if you just clock it to 96 AD, it had already been over 2 decades. And there's not one hint? No. So, for those of us who hold to an earlier dating of the book of Revelation, we're called, somewhat pejoratively, preterists. And that's because we believe that if the book were written in an earlier time, then most of what Revelation refers to, these apocalyptic visions and what have you, all had taken place under Nero, who ostensibly is also the beast, and this Jewish persecution along with the Christian persecution and the eventual diaspora. Ergo, all of the prophecies have been fulfilled, and everything is done. So Revelation really isn't a revelation per se. Well, understandably, Orthodox Christianity has a big problem with that, and they don't subscribe to it at all. So if you're looking at eschatologists such as Timothy LaHaye, Hal Lindsey, John Hagee, for example, they're going to stomp their feet and they're going to vociferously disagree with everything that I've just said.
With no historical evidence to back them up.
Well, they gloss over the historical evidence. They look at everything through a different prism. And so I want to raise some of these issues because
it's a harder path when you take a history into account.
Well, it also eliminates the grandiose, idea of what's going to...
Magic?
Yeah. What's going to happen, the prophecies and things. Not that there may not be some prophecies in, the book of Revelations, but when I was first taught, associated with the Bible college, it was like practically all prophecy. And now when I look at it, I realize that it was written, a lot of that revelation John had was written to the churches of that time and what was going to happen to them. It was prophecy for them at that time.
All right, let me ask you something. Today, we love going to fortune tellers. We like to imagine that we can learn the future. That sort of mindset just occupies a lot of our conscious thought. We want to know what's going to happen. We want to be able to see around the corner. So my question to you is this. Aside from the fact that modern eschatology, and I know I'm going to piss a lot of people off, I understand that. You probably already pissed off at me, but I don't care. These are my thoughts. This is my opinion. And not to hammer it home, but you need to stop and think about this for a moment. Okay? Modern eschatology is big business.
That's right.
It's huge business. Without modern eschatology, without Revelation being interpreted the way it has been interpreted, Timothy LaHaye would have not had a book series. And he made decent money. He had made a handsome sum on the Left Behind series.
And a really bad movie with Nicolas Cage would not have been made. Just think of how humanity would have been served.
Yeah. You know what? I haven't brought myself to see that one yet.
Don't.
over this plane have simply vanished.
Chris, let me in! Chris!
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
I heard some doctors talking. It's not just here. It's all over the world.
Chloe, are you okay?
Yeah, but Mom and Raimi, they're both gone.
Irene knew this was coming. The way it happened. How could she know that?
But
I would rather shove red hot spoons in my eyes.
it's not just the Nicolas Cage movie. It's not just Left Behind series. It's also the ad nauseum books, programs by John Hagee and the Christian Zionist movement, the Red Heifer, all of this stuff.
It destroys the whole Christian Zionist movement.
It exists because of this misinterpretation of the Book of Revelation and the refusal to acknowledge that the earlier dating of the book is more in keeping with the historical events than this latter. I've got a quote, and I'm going to read it in a little bit when we get going. I'm going to read it to you right from Against Heresies by Irenaeus. Now, Against Heresies is interesting because he wrote it essentially to counter the growing Gnostic movement that was occurring at that time. And the Gnostics were no one fixed group of people. They were all over the place. And Irenaeus regarded an earlier church leader named Marcion, a synope. I don't necessarily regard Marcion as a Gnostic because Marcion didn't claim to have any secret knowledge per se. Marcion came to some conclusions. But Valentinus was regarded as a Gnostic. Valentinus came, hair's breadth away from becoming the Bishop of Rome, and it was only at the last moment that they decided to choose somebody else. And at that time, Valentinus decided, "Screw you all! I'll make my own church," and he went off into this Gnostic bent, which upset a lot of the early church at that time because they each had their own group of followers. Marcionism was very popular at the time. And Valentinus was also had his own band of followers. So anyway, Irenaeus,
which had been going on since the start of the early church. I mean, Paul addressed the same issues.
There was some divergence. You follow Paul, you follow Apollo, sort of a thing.
Right.
This was really diverging, though. These were people who claimed that they had essentially, for example, when Paul had his Damascus Road experience, he claimed over and over again, "I was taught by no apostle, I was taught by no man,
I was taught only
everything
by Christ.
came to me from the power of the Spirit." And so these other guys look at this and they think, well,
I can say that.
Hell, we can say it too.
Yeah.
But
and they did.
They did, but it led them to conclusions which are just way off. And if you've ever read... some people who are listening to us, I'm sure, are familiar with these discoveries of these Gnostic works called the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Judas, etc. I don't know if you've actually read them. I have read them. I will admit that I am not an academic scholar on the level of some of the theologians that have pored over them, or archaeologists who have pored over them, but I know enough that when, for example, you're reading the Gospel of Thomas and you see that Christ is painted out as little more than a petulant child with superpowers, that's not really in keeping with the description of God as outlined in Galatians 5:22 and 23. So if I can't accept that it's God in the Old Testament who also doesn't fit in with Galatians 5:22 and 23, then I'm not going to look at a depiction of God in the Gospel of Thomas as a petulant little boy with superpowers, blasting people with the superpowers, and expect that that's going to be the same depiction of God. They both fail, in my opinion, the smell test, if you will. So on that point alone, the Gospel of Thomas ceases to be a legitimized work. Now, I've read other papers with respect to both of these Gnostic works who also say that if you look at the writing, if you look at the style, if you look at the topography that they describe, none of it matches up. And so there's other deeper issues that go into with respect to whether or not these are contemporary works of the apostles. And most of them believe that they are not, that they are in fact works that were written long after the fact. In other words, the Gospel of Thomas was not written by Thomas or anybody that Thomas was even associated with. It was somebody who wrote something and attributed it to Thomas's name, because in those days, if you had secret stuff, if you had works, if you found something, all of a sudden you became a superstar. You were part of an outlaw religion, but within the confines of that religion, you were a superstar and you were granted lots of little benefits. And that's what led these people to do this. It was a sort of a superstar status. And then so on and on and on. This was gaining in such popularity, and in Irenaeus' view, diluting the truth of the gospel so much he needed to do something about it. So he wrote this huge, huge work. And it's broken up into 5 different books. And the dating of the book of Revelation comes in a mention that Irenaeus makes in book 5, chapter 30, at the very end of the chapter. And it's fascinating because there's something else he also mentions in that chapter with respect to who he believes the beast is. And I found that extraordinarily fascinating. We're also going to get into that. But I'd like to get on more with everyone else's thoughts with respect to what I've talked about so far with this dating of the book of Revelation. Am I loony? Am I off the mark?
Were you going to read
I am, but I don't want to monopolize here.
My opinion. After becoming a Christian, I instantly had a desire to read the book of Revelation. I can't explain why. I'm not going to say God was leading me into it or anything along those lines. I was just curious. I wanted to read it. I wanted to understand it. And I went with the typical modern theology teaching because I didn't know better. Up until about 10 years into my Christian walk, when I realized one thing. If the book of Revelation was as Christian theology describes it, it is the only book in the Bible that was 100% complete prophecy.
Revelation you're talking about.
The book itself of Revelation. You know, we could go to other prophetic books from the Old Testament, and yes, they dealt with prophecies, but they were not solely about prophecy. So that one detail bothered me, and that is what led me down the path to basically...
The detail that it was all prophecy and nothing else?
And nothing else bothered me, because it stood out like a sore thumb. It just did not.
Well, that's true. It wasn't
in.
necessarily in keeping with the theme of everything else. But also, even when you read John's Gospel, I mean, John's Gospel is different in tone.
Different in tone
and information than the other synoptic Gospels.
I agree, but that is also because of the fact that it is the writer's view and the message that he's trying to impart. But when you still run across the book of Revelation, it's still saying all this is going to happen someday. And
no, he says soon, not someday. He says soon.
Yeah, soon, someday. 6 in one hand, half dozen in the other. What is soon to God?
Well, but there's the argument you make, okay, and or rather not you, but the eschatology makes is that okay? Soon is a vagary because 1,000 years is like a day, and a day is like 1,000 years to God. Well, hell,
that's
okay,
way out
come
of
on.
Context. Come on.
There is a certain level of license you're going to be able to take when you're using that as an excuse, and the situation is this: what that phrase there implies is that God is atemporal. He is eternal. Time does not have a meaning to him. But this is a book written specifically to people here on terra firma in this temporal bubble.
About a very specific time.
About a specific event. And of what point is there to convey it to a first century church if they will live and die and never see a hint of it?
Exactly. And that is what bothered me.
If you will attach yourself to eschatology as it's understood by the Orthodox Church today, it has been 2,000 years almost.
And that is what
and it still hasn't happened yet.
About the Book of Revelation. It was this whole concept of this one book is written to a specific group of people that is yet to see life at the time it was written. Well, I just found that erroneous. And the more I researched it, the more I researched the dating and the time, the more I found out we based this off of a stupid assumption.
Well, not an assumption so much. When Eusebius wrote his ecclesiastical history, he said that the book was written by John on Patmos in the last year of reign of Domitian. But when you go back, and fortunately, there were so many copies of Against Heresies. There's more legitimate copies of Against Heresies than there are of the Gospels themselves.
I would agree. 100%.
Yeah, it's there, and it was widely disseminated because that was Irenaeus's point.
Well, that's the way we can tell what's true and what's not.
It was originally written in Greek, whereas Eusebius was versed in Latin. Greek was not his language.
No.
And so there was this tense problem with respect to translation. Now today we can go through and we can see that, and even the most ardent scholars with respect to Orthodox thought of the latter dating will say, it can read that way, but there's so much that the tradition says is this.
But if I don't go with tradition, I won't have a job teaching at this university.
Well, it's not just that. It's also it's if you start to unravel, the very foundations of the Catholic Church, and this is where Eusebius. This is why Eusebius was employed.
Exactly.
Okay, Augustine made his big mark by tearing down Marcion. And he did like 9 volumes or something on the heresies of Marcion, and just tore him a new one. Eusebius, ecclesiastical history. What's the history of the church? Nobody knows. Blah blah blah. Goes into pulls a lot of his information from obviously Against Heresies. Why? Because Irenaeus did it first, and he was only 160 years out. It's quite possible. And a lot of archaeologists, historians, if you will, believe that Irenaeus and Polycarp knew each other, maybe even worked together. Polycarp
I've read some of that.
Was a student of John the Apostle's. So, in this respect, you're getting some almost first, second-hand evidence. It's no little thing.
No.
So when we date this book later than it should be,
we develop a lot of problems.
Well, you create a different world. You create an alternate universe. And so now we've got a whole...
Grass is now blue, the sky is now red.
Perspective on it.
Hey, you've got generations and generations and generations of Christians who are looking for something that's not going to happen that way.
Okay, we have a group...
Okay, but what do you do with what it says right in there that it's a prophecy? So what do you do with that?
We have a group of people right now today that believe Israel that exists today is the Israel of the Book of Revelation, and they are convinced that once one generation came about, that would be the end of the world. The only problem is that they're now about 10, 20 years past what they should be.
And
that's because people keep dating.
You know what that's done? What you just brought up, what you guys have talked about, is a huge scenario of what's happened in the Christian church. And here's what's happened. Because of that the wrong dating, the wrong concept, the focus that these people put on in their Christian walk in life is to try to make some prophecy to come about that even if it is a prophecy, it's not their prophecy.
Absolutely,
it's God's.
And that's Christian Zionism. They are going to make it happen if it doesn't on its own.
Taken their focus, their church's focus, the organization, it's taken their focus off of what's real.
And you know who else is doing that? Is Islam. Islam extremist Muslims, I'm not talking about the fundamentalists now, because we use this term radical.
Well, are we using the proper term?
No, we're using radical radical Islamics improperly. A radical Islamic, a radical Muslim is one who gets along with his neighbors, loves his neighbors, is not going to blow them up. Allahu Akbar! Explosion. No.
Allahu Akbar!
That is a radical Muslim because they are going
against...
radical
Muslim that says, I'm going to worship my God, you worship your God, you'll pay for it.
They're going against the tenets of their faith.
But what we call radical is
actually a fundamentalist.
They're fundamentalists, but they do radical things.
No, not by their stripe.
Not by theirs, but by ours.
By ours, and that's where we confuse the situation. We measure them by our scale rather than measuring them by theirs.
By their religious
they are
works.
Fundamentalist according to the tenets.
What do their religious tenets say?
Right.
The extremist wing within even the fundamentalist aspect of Muslims believe in the 12th Imam. That's kind of like their returning Christ.
Right.
And they are doing a lot of what they're doing
to bring it about.
Because they want to bring it about. And so in that respect, they are no different than these Christian Zionists who are trying to cleanse the earth of the infidel from their perspective so that Christ will return. And that's why you see these movements to grow the red heifer. It's got to be perfectly spotless, etc., so they can slit its throat on the new temple. Well, the only way they're going to get that temple is if they destroy the dome on the rock first. And how do you think these fundamentalist Muslims are going to take to that?
Well, the whole problem there is...
Probably not very well, especially now that Iran, thanks to President Barack Hussein Obama, has all but given them nuclear capability.
Nuclear capability, gave them satellite capability, give them missile capability.
Well, that was President Bill Clinton.
It depends upon what the meaning of the word is.
Yeah. And his Vice President Al Gore.
The Earth has a fever, and the fever is rising.
To Iran.
No, not to Iran, but the Russians will give it to Iran. They already have.
I'm going to jump back to a concept because I want to make sure our listeners understand that there's an answer to the question I brought up about the Book of Revelation declares that that in itself that it's a prophecy, okay? And we say, well, wait a minute, this isn't all prophecy. But by the changing of the dating or understanding when this was dated, it was a prophecy, but it was a prophecy that was to come soon.
I contend that, yes. At the time that John wrote
so some of the prophecy majority of it has been fulfilled.
There's been fulfillment of prophecy within the Book of Revelation. I also still believe that there are prophecies yet to be fulfilled. I do believe that it does speak to whatever the end of a coming age was to be. But what we have done is we have put everything in one bin, and so we're expecting everything to fall into this one type of the end of an age, when that's not what's going on at all. There's a different situation that's going to occur that will end this age.
We have a lot of philosophy in the Christian church right now that we're in the last days. And as I have pointed out probably for the last 20 some odd years, every generation that has come up in the church has sworn that they were in the last days, that the world could get no worse. They would take the scripture verse, like in the days of Noah, and they would run with that, not knowing what they were even talking about. And it's like, pay attention. Read history. Our world is no different as far as the morality of people than it was in the first century, than it was in BC times. We are not any worse. We are not any better.
Well, and if you misinterpret Revelations, they even thought they were in the last days then.
Yeah.
The point is, yes, every Christian right now is in the last days of their generation. They
but last
will
days,
have to give up their life in their last days. And the question will be, what did you do with your life? And if it was, well, I prepared for the rapture that didn't happen, you didn't prepare for it.
But the last days are not necessarily the end of an age.
No.
Because there were many people that lived beyond the Victorian age. And it was called the Victorian age because Queen Victoria ruled absolute. Britain was the world superpower at the time, and what she decreed
worked.
Essentially was the majority of rule in Western civilization.
Sun never set on the British Empire.
And so that was an age that ended when she died. Her son didn't have the same sort of an age. You can call it the Edwardian age if you want, but it had nowhere near the same impact as the Victorian age.
No,
Victorian age still sits with us. So I'm going to get back to this here for a second with respect to what Irenaeus wrote. And what I said earlier is that it was a little piece at the end of chapter 30 of book 5. And during this period, he's talking about who he believes the Antichrist is. Interestingly enough, Irenaeus understood what a gematria was.
That's surprising.
Speculated heavily on who the Antichrist was based upon this gematria. So I'm going to pick up kind of in the middle, but what I think is pertinent.
Because I would go to the aspect of saying that most modern-day theologians do not know.
It depends where they were schooled, and I'll get to it at gematria in a second.
You call him a theologian.
So let me start here. Among many persons, too, this name is accounted divine, so that even the sun is termed Titan, quote-unquote, by those who do not now possess the rule. This word, too, contains a certain outward appearance of vengeance, and one inflicting merited punishment because he, the Antichrist, pretends that he vindicates the oppressed. And besides this, it is an ancient name, one worthy of credit, of royal dignity, and still further, a name belonging to a tyrant. Inasmuch, then, as this name, quote, Titan, has so much to recommend it, there is a strong degree of probability that from among the many names suggested, we infer that, perchance, he who is to come shall be called, quote, Titan. Irenaeus was referring to the name of the Antichrist, Titan. Now we get into the little piece that Eusebius pulled. We will not, however, incur the risk of pronouncing positively as to the name of the Antichrist. For if it were necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed in this present time, this is about 160, 165 AD, it would have been announced by him who beheld the apocalyptic vision, that being John the Apostle. For that was seen no very long time since, but almost in our day, towards the end of Domitian's reign. That is how Eusebius concluded that the apocalypse was written in the year 96 AD. He took that little piece at the end where Irenaeus was trying to explain who John was, and that if we should have known, if it was necessary for us to know the exact name of the Antichrist, which was just abbreviated with the numeral 666, which is a gematria, and we're going to get into that in here in a second, that's all he was doing. He was just identifying. John would have said, hey, it's Nero, or hey, it's Fred down the street.
It's Henry Kissinger.
But he didn't, and so Irenaeus is just saying, hey, look, it's not for me to say. John could have said it if he wanted, but he decided to leave it this way, and, hey, he was still kicking around in 96 AD. Again, this is some 70 years hence. That's what's going on. Eusebius took this out of its Greek, mistranslated it, and said, oh, John must have written the book in 96 AD. And so all the pinheads today go, well, book was written in 96 AD. And interestingly enough, the more liberal a theologian you are, that date gets pushed even further. There are some liberal theologians who will push the date of Revelation out to 120, 130 AD because it fits their narrative. So, what is a gematria?
What is it? Anyone else want to jump in on this? Gematria is a game played by both Hebrews and Romans.
Well, it's not so much a game.
It was a game in some aspects. And they assigned a numerical value to each letter. And when added up, if you knew the correct numbers, you could figure out who they were talking about. It was also a way of code. And very important
It was a very well-known in certain segments of society, an alphanumeric code. Whereas for example, the Greek, which it seemed to work the best, Greek letters 1 through 9 were given the numerical equivalent of 1 through 9. 10 through 20 were given a numerical equivalent of 10 through 90. 11 through 20 were given the numerical equivalent of 100 through 900. And so based upon the letter in the name, you could go to this little chart, if you will, and you could then transliterating what it comes down to. You could assign the numerical value to each letter and therefore come up with this figure at the end. Now, what's interesting is that, and this was pointed out by Irenaeus too, I didn't read the earlier passage in chapter 30 of book 5, but he got into the situation where there was more than Nero Caesar, whose name added up to 666. Nero Caesar only adds up to 666 if you transliterate the name Nero Caesar in Greek to Hebrew. In Greek, Nero Caesar's name in the Gematria comes to 1005. 1005 is the number. So, my question is why is John referring to 666 if it's not Nero? Now, this is a curveball I'm throwing in there because it does transliterate out to Nero, and there's some people who speculate that John would have clearly seen, but by throwing in the little Hebrew transliteration curve, he would have thrown off any Roman soldiers who would have seen that, well, hey, we already know that Nero's gematria is 1005. And so by John putting it in Hebrew and giving it a little spin, only the learned would have been able to figure it out. Because there was another name of a demagogue. And demagogue is kind of one of those terms that are loosely applied to, for example, hybrids, titans, Nephilim. Mm-hmm. This one's Latinios, and it was a king who presided over the lands, which eventually was conquered by Alexander the Great, and the Ptolemies got to it in the Roman Republic. Basically, king of the Latins back in that Hellenistic area. His name also, Latinos, comes out to 666. The name Saturn, as vouched by Pliny the Elder and Ovid and Aurelius, if you truncate it into its Chaldean term to stir rather than Saturn, stir also comes out to 666. Of course, Nero. And then Titan, T-E-I-T-A-N, another name of a demagogue. It's used also by the Chaldean. They changed the name a little bit. They pronounce it Shaitan, which is S-H-E-I-T-A-N, is just the Chaldean form of the same name. It's a demagogue. That one also, when applied through the Greek gematria matrix, comes out to 666. So we've got these four. One has to be transliterated into Hebrew to come out to 666. One seems to fit the situation surrounding Revelation. So I just wanted to put this out so that it's there. I found four. Two of these that I mentioned, excepting Saturn, Irenaeus also pointed out. So there we are. Thoughts?
My personal belief is that John was avoiding problems with the Roman guards, the Roman centurions, because he was writing this at the time of being persecuted.
Oh, sure. If you agree that it was going on during the Neronian persecutions.
Yeah, he wrote this at a time that he was in grave danger, and he knew it.
But here's the deal.
And he knew that anyone that carried this letter was in grave danger.
And here's where I came up with this. Okay, I understood, the more I researched gematria, that it was widely known. It stretched credulity that only Roman soldiers would not have been able to figure out what 666 was. Right. And so when I was doing some digging, and I came across this transliteration into the Hebrew, suddenly it made sense. It's like, okay, since even in antiquity, people understood that Nero's gematria was 1005. If they saw 666, they would either key on it as one of these other demagogues from ancient antiquity, I mean, way ancient antiquity.
And not think anything of it.
Tatian goes all the way back into ancient friggin' times.
Right.
And if a Roman soldier were to come across that and go, well, hell, I know this is just some bug from the ancients. It's some demon.
Who cares?
Who cares?
Exactly.
But if he transliterated it into Hebrew, and you can see there's a little worksheet I've got here where they did that, and it comes out to 666, only those understanding the Hebrew and able to do the transliteration would have understood, no, we're talking about Nero. Well, this is Nero we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And you guys don't know it because you're not versed in Hebrew.
Right, because John was going to protect those that carried the
And
letters.
that answered a long, nagging question of mine, which is, how could the Roman soldiers be that stupid? They had to have been able to figure this out. And this, when it says in Revelation,
let him who has ears have understanding.
What is it? He who's wise. I don't have my book open in front of me, Mark. What does it say?
You got the gist of it.
Anyway, that always bugged me. From the moment I read about, learned about the gematria to...
Let him calculate the number of his name.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. How could the Roman soldiers not know it when it was so widely known? It was not a hidden code. It was ubiquitous.
You read, if any Roman soldier intercepted this, which I'm sure they did, it was pretty screwy. I mean, even if you understand the language, which they did, it was written in such a way that it doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
Perhaps, but if they would have keyed in on the fact that they saw the number of the beast is 1005,
if they got that far,
they would have known that this is referring to Nero Caesar.
I'm going to jump in with the actual scripture verse that we're discussing here, and it's Revelations 13:18, and I'm going to use starting at 18. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. So it's very specific. He's not talking about a demigod. He's saying this belongs to a human. This belongs to a man. This belongs to a ruler. And you're going to have to understand exactly what I'm saying.
It's not even a celestial being.
No. He's saying you're going to have to understand, if you understand exactly what I've written, what I'm writing, you'll know who I'm talking about.
You know, but all we're talking about today, I've been listening for a long time. While you guys were talking, I read through the whole book of Revelation again. It's real simple to read. You can read it in 20 minutes, maybe 25.
All right, well, I never studied Evelyn Wood, so...
It's really easy.
Yeah, you can.
But we get all caught up in it, and I think we're talking to people today, if there's anyone listening out there, about this mysterious book, because there's been a lot of societal changes from this book. A lot of people, they come to a religious experience, and
go ahead,
and they hear about God, they hear about Jesus. That, could have been a car wreck in the family, could have been a death of a child, something, and they start going to a church, and immediately, before you really know anything, we all have preconceived notions from TV, radio programs, just being involved in society itself. We've got little niblets of comprehension about what God is and what a relationship's like. But when we finally come to that point where we go into the church, we accept Jesus as our Lord and Savior, or even in a Catholic church in which you just simply decide to accept their teachings and follow their program, or a Seventh-day Adventist church, or Jehovah's Witness church, you name it. You don't have a lot of understanding. And one thing they all kind of push on, except for the Catholics, is this end-time scenario called eschatology. And from that moment, you're kind of led, like with a ring through your nose, through the Scriptures with an eschatological bent. In other words, you're told the world's going to end, the world's going to be destroyed.
Sure.
You're going to be told that all wrongs will be righted. No matter what's happened in your life, what you've read, seen on TV, what you've experienced, it'll all be okay, because in the end, God's going to triumph, and here's how it's going to happen. And so the book of Revelation holds that key to a mystery of equality, an equalizer program that God has set up. Don't worry, He's going to take care of it. So you really don't know much about it. You get into the book, and if you don't understand history, because you're talking about history, and you don't really care to understand history, you're going to latch on and be the understudy of your pastor, of your Sunday school teacher, of a friend, of somebody, maybe a radio program. Maybe
who you presume has done the necessary
right.
work.
Most people think that people who write books understand what's going on. Most people think that people that speak from the pulpit understand what's going on ad infinitum. They think that just like a doctor knows what he's doing, these people know what they're doing.
Yeah, well, God wouldn't allow them to be there.
Well, that's their tender faith.
Yeah, if they didn't belong there, God wouldn't allow
they
them
believe
to be
that.
there.
Yeah, God wouldn't allow Jim Jones either, right?
Well, so I remember when I got involved with the church, and very quickly I was swallowed up into a very fundamental, oppressive environment in which they would preach for long periods of time. They seemed very intellectual, and they always knew everything about the Bible. And I had a hard time with memory in my early days. I really couldn't remember much. It's part of youth. And so I wanted to do what's right and wanted to obey God. I absorbed as much as I could, but I trusted them with my full heart.
Yeah, because that's the way it's supposed to be.
That's what we did.
That's what they teach you.
Right.
You surrender, you
But
yield.
then you still have those nagging splinters in your mind saying, this doesn't make sense.
So you come to the book of Revelation. I remember I was a high jumper, and I had an Olympic trials invite, playing everything. I was one of the top 12 in the nation.
Until Jimmy
chosen.
Carter.
Well, yeah, they boycotted 80, but in 76 is when I had the... Anyway, but the point is that I was approached by Athletes in Action. They offered I wouldn't have to work, and I could get money per month just by representing them with a shirt. It looked really good, but there was this nagging thing in my mind because of church. And they just basically said that the world's going to end soon. And I remember reading Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth right before the Olympics, right before taking that plane trip.
Notice old Hal didn't give up his job, though.
Good evening, and welcome to this edition of the Hal Lindsey Report. When the Lord called me to the prophetic ministry many decades ago, I knew that while the big news was good news, it was going to be carried in on an ever-increasing wave of bad news.
And I had scholarship, as a matter of fact, multiple scholarship offers, even when I left my college. And I was stuck in my mind. I didn't know what to do. So I found myself not caring anymore, not going to practice. I quit school, and I gave it all up because I was certain that Jesus was going to return very shortly. So I learned all I could. I was going to Bible studies.
Well, from a personal view,
yeah,
I'm graduating high school. I have a ride to a college that teaches computer science. Now we're talking before people had PCs, and I passed up the scholarship because I didn't want to have anything to do with the beast.
Right.
Because we were taught computers
were evil.
Were going to be the beast.
And what Mark said, they taught, the church would teach you that you got to give up the things of the world. You got to give up the things of the world. Let them go.
Right. I remember how much that bothered my heart and my soul, and I didn't have the capabilities of being able to talk with them on a level basis. So whatever they said, I believed. Whatever I read, I believed. And I thought...
Well, you start reading through the eyes that you've been taught to read with, so that's all you see.
Right. So when you're given a position, like the end time scenario in Revelation talks about the tribulation period, and we haven't even hit on that yet, but there's three schools of thought. One is pre-trib,
God bless
rapture. Now this is with the rapture. Rapture is when Jesus comes and takes people off the earth. He first removes the dead in Christ and then takes people bodily alive up to heaven or in the heavens. Okay, so
by the time they reach about 10,000 feet, they go unconscious because, first off, it's really, really cold and there's no air, and they die.
There's the position.
So they are in heaven by the time they get to heaven.
Well, there's the position called the pre-tribulation rapture, in which Christians are removed from the earth prior to anything happening.
They're just walking along
and then there's the mid-tribulation rapture, which means after the first 3.5 years, when the Antichrist has actually taken power, and the world's going great financially, we're going great socially.
So we know it's not Obama.
Anyway, so then before the hard times come, the Christians are extradited. Boom. And the dead. And then there's a third school of thought that says that after the 7 years, they have to endure to the end.
Then it could be Obama.
Then
it could be.
They're taken out. Well, it's taught in churches as not a theory, like the theory of evolution is taught not as a theory, it's taught as a fact, which is really absurd because it's so full of holes. It's just that it's taught over and over as a theory from the time you're a child until you're adult.
So they apply the Clinton presidency view. Tell a lie and keep telling the lie until you believe the lie.
Well, they tell the theory of evolution in schools from young people, young kindergartners now, all the way up through school as a fact. It's not a reasonable assumption that it's a theory any longer. It's taught as a fact. And if you go against that grain, you're ridiculed. Well, the problem is in Christianity is they teach the rapture as fact. And if you go against that, you're ridiculed, and then people argue about at what point are you extradited from the earth, pre, mid, or post. Well, the problem is very few people have ever studied into that to see if it's even a viable truth. As you learn today, or I hope the audience learned today, that when the book of Revelation was actually written, to say that John wrote it in the mid or late 90s AD is an absurdity. Because if you read carefully through the book of Revelation, as Chase pointed out, there are certain events lacking. The biggest one is the destruction of the temple.
Yeah, you would think that would have been mentioned by somebody.
It is absent.
Let's not forget the ransacking of Jerusalem and the temple helped paid for the Colosseum.
That was a 6-year siege. In process.
Yeah, if you go back to 64 when the fire happened and then the persecutions were stepped up and everything.
Well, I'm talking 67 to 73.
Well, 66 is when Vespasian was sent in to calm the Jewish revolt.
Right, but at first it wasn't an all-out war yet. My point in this is that from 64 till 60. Right around the end of 66, they saw the hope of let's bring peace because Jerusalem represented a very positive influence for towards the east for Rome. They were the vanguard towards the east, and that's why they tolerated them. Okay, but the point I'm trying to make here is that we come into this religious situation with little or no knowledge of world history. And on top of that, we're taught not to read world history.
Exactly. And that was the point I was trying to get to, is that when I used to bring this subject up, when I was in church, it was like, no, it doesn't really matter. World history is filled with lies. You can't believe it because they're anti-Christian. You shouldn't believe anything they say. If it's not in the Bible, don't acknowledge it. And I don't know how many times I've heard that come out of Christian pastors' mouths.
Well, yeah.
About a nickel.
And they also use that standard, God can do anything.
The Lord can do anything.
Listen, moving on.
Can he? Can he lie?
He won't.
Well, can he kill himself?
Even if
you just look at the way he behaves, he tends to follow the rules and regulations that are set up on this earth. So he doesn't circumvent them. He doesn't say they don't exist anymore. He says, I'll work within it.
Yeah, so to the public out there who fervently believe in, like, Tim LaHaye's book, that he's got a massive following, and they love to read the book, and they probably enjoyed the movie, but not as much as the book.
Neville Walter for the book.
Yeah, they really, the idea that Jesus is coming and getting us out of here, the idea that you're in that generation that's going to see it all happen.
Escapism.
It's escapism, but it's exciting. There's purpose to life. And so Christians will get together, they'll meet, they'll eat, they'll greet, they'll do everything together, and they know fundamentally in their mind that very soon, and it could be tomorrow, that Jesus is returning for us.
Did you read Tim LaHaye's series?
Yeah. It got really weird towards...
Did you read everything?
It got really weird after like the second page.
No.
I read them up until the middle of the very last book, and this was after Christ had returned.
Right, and Christ was hovering around.
Christ was like a stalker. He's hovering around you while you're having sex. And I thought, this either Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins are spun, or
no, they just didn't understand.
They're on drugs or something.
They didn't know how to incorporate certain things.
It just draws me back to the internet, and Ceiling Cat is watching you. I mean,
that was it. I could not. I tried. I could not finish that book.
The position,
it was just so insipidly vacant.
The position.
It's like saying, "You young people, do not touch yourself. Jesus is watching."
Well, no, it's the euphoria and the hope it produces in the hearts of the readers that you are right. You're on board with something, and people like that. Okay, but the idea of studying and the stuff we're studying is really hard for most people, so I don't hold that against them. There's no possible
I do, because
way.
It's hard for me.
No, there's no possible, unless the Holy Spirit enlightens a person.
Partly laziness.
And according to the book of Revelation,
Exactly.
there are 7 spirits, folks, not 1. It says it 3 times at least, that there are 7 spirits.
Well, that just means because God's using the number 7 to be complete.
That comes from old Hebrew.
They use that
understanding, the sevenfold or multifold.
Well, it's
but the
spirit
7
of God.
spirits is also in Revelations is also used to describe that's the Holy Spirit.
Well, sadly, we're going to have to leave it there for right now because we have run out of time for this week's episode. So, for
Lou Rodgers,
Mark Wilson,
and David Cameron,
I am Chase Rockwell saying so long until the next time you find yourself across the cosmos.
Send any questions or comments to us via email at info@acrossthecosmos.com. Also, visit us on the web at www.acrossthecosmos.com for show updates, news, and other important information. No part of this podcast may be used without the express written permission from the staff of Across the Cosmos. Across the Cosmos is a production of Omite Corporation. Copyright 2015.